The people who misuse authority rarely expect anyone to remember what they did. The late afternoon sun hung low above Highway 41 outside Birmingham, Alabama, casting long shadows across the pavement as thousands of commuters made their way home. Traffic moved steadily beneath a sky painted with streaks of orange and gold. Behind the wheel of a dark gray Cadillac Escalade, Marcus Reed drove with the quiet confidence that came from years of hard work. At 38 years old, Marcus had built a successful construction company from nothing. He had spent years earning trust, creating jobs, and helping neighborhoods that many investors ignored. This evening should have been simple. He was on his way to finalize preparations for a major community development project that could bring new opportunities to hundreds of local families. Instead, within seconds, everything changed. Flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. Marcus glanced down at his speedometer. Nothing seemed unusual. Still, the patrol vehicle remained directly behind him. Calmly, he activated his turn signal and guided the SUV onto the shoulder. Gravel crackled beneath the tires as he came to a complete stop. Vehicles rushed past while curious drivers briefly looked toward the scene before continuing down the highway. A patrol car door opened. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out and approached with deliberate confidence. Tall, experienced, and wearing a dark navy uniform, Ryan carried himself like a man who expected immediate compliance. Marcus lowered his window and offered a polite greeting. "Good afternoon, officer." Ryan barely acknowledged it. His eyes moved slowly across the vehicle before settling on Marcus. "License and registration." Marcus handed over the documents without hesitation. Ryan studied them for several moments. Then his gaze shifted back toward Marcus. "Nice vehicle." Marcus nodded politely. "Thank you." Ryan looked at the SUV once more. "These are not cheap." The comment lingered longer than it should have. Marcus recognized the tone immediately. It was not admiration. It was suspicion. He remained composed. Ryan continued examining the paperwork. Everything appeared valid. Registration. Insurance. Identification. Yet instead of concluding the stop, he asked another question. Then another. And another. Where had Marcus been? Where was he going? What kind of work did he do? How long had he owned the vehicle? Marcus answered calmly each time. The more respectful he remained, the more uncomfortable the conversation seemed to become. Then Ryan spoke loudly enough for nearby motorists to hear. "Funny how some people always seem to have the perfect explanation ready." The words immediately changed the atmosphere. A driver passing by slowed down. Another turned their head. A woman near the entrance of a nearby gas station stopped walking and looked toward the shoulder. Within minutes, several people were watching. Some reached for their phones. Others simply observed from a distance. Marcus felt the attention growing around him, but he refused to react emotionally. He understood that every decision mattered. Ryan, however, seemed unaware that the encounter was no longer private. More witnesses were arriving with every passing minute. More eyes were focused on the roadside. And without realizing it, both men had already stepped into the opening moments of a story that would soon extend far beyond Highway 41. Marcus remained seated behind the wheel with the engine idling softly while Officer Ryan Mitchell continued examining documents that had already been verified. The evening traffic flowed steadily past the shoulder, but the atmosphere around the stop felt strangely frozen, as if time itself had slowed. More drivers were noticing the scene. A few parked near the gas station across the road. Others lingered longer than necessary before continuing on their way. The attention would have made most people uncomfortable. Marcus understood that. Yet he refused to let frustration guide his actions. Years of building a company had taught him the value of patience. Ryan returned to the driver's window and held the paperwork in one hand. "Step out of the vehicle for a moment." Marcus complied immediately. He opened the door, stepped onto the shoulder, and stood calmly beside the Escalade. The warm Alabama breeze carried the distant sounds of passing trucks and evening traffic. Ryan slowly walked around the vehicle, studying it from different angles. "How long have you owned this SUV?" he asked. "About 2 years," Marcus replied. "And what exactly do you do?" Marcus answered as he had before. "I own a construction company." Ryan nodded slowly. "Construction company." His expression suggested doubt rather than interest. Marcus noticed several people nearby watching closely. A delivery driver leaned against his truck. A young woman stood near a fuel pump holding her phone at chest level. Others remained inside their vehicles observing through windshields. The stop had become a public event. Ryan continued asking questions. None appeared connected to the original reason for the stop. He asked about Marcus's business. He asked about his travel plans. He asked about the vehicle again. Each answer remained consistent. Each answer seemed to generate another question. What surprised many of the witnesses was Marcus's composure. He never raised his voice. He never challenged the officer. He simply responded respectfully and waited. The contrast between the two men became increasingly noticeable. One appeared determined to extend the encounter. The other appeared determined not to lose control of himself. Ryan finally looked directly at Marcus. "You seem awfully comfortable standing here." Marcus met his gaze. "I am simply cooperating, officer." The answer was calm, but something about it seemed to irritate Ryan. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The flashing patrol lights reflected across the polished surface of the SUV while the sun drifted lower toward the horizon. Then Ryan asked a question that caused several nearby witnesses to exchange glances. "Are you sure this vehicle belongs to you?" Marcus looked briefly at the registration that Ryan still held in his hand. The document already answered the question. Yet the question had been asked anyway. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied evenly. "It is registered in my name." Ryan said nothing. He simply stared at him. Across the road, more phones appeared. The people watching were no longer focused on Marcus. Their attention had shifted. Every additional minute seemed to raise a new question. Why was the stop continuing? Why were the same subjects being revisited? Why did the tension feel so unnecessary? Marcus could feel the mood changing around them. Without realizing it, Ryan was no longer controlling how the situation looked. The crowd was forming its own conclusions. And somewhere among the growing collection of witnesses, cameras were beginning to preserve details that neither man would soon be able to ignore. The roadside scene continued drawing attention as daylight slowly surrendered to evening. What had started as a traffic stop was becoming something else entirely. Drivers passing along Highway 41 could sense it immediately. Some slowed down. Others glanced repeatedly through their windows. A few pulled into the nearby gas station and remained there longer than necessary. The growing crowd was no longer reacting to Marcus Reed. Instead, they were reacting to the unusual length and tone of the encounter. Marcus stood quietly beside his Escalade with his hands relaxed at his sides. His expression remained calm despite the uncomfortable situation. Years of negotiating contracts, managing projects, and leading employees had taught him that composure often revealed more strength than confrontation. Officer Ryan Mitchell, however, appeared increasingly frustrated by the lack of reaction. Every question he asked received a respectful answer. Every attempt to provoke an emotional response seemed to fail. The contrast was becoming impossible for witnesses to ignore. Near the gas station entrance, a college student lifted her phone and began recording continuously. Across the parking lot, a delivery driver did the same. A retired couple standing near their vehicle exchanged concerned looks before quietly joining the growing number of observers. Within minutes, multiple cameras were capturing different angles of the same scene. Some focused on Marcus. Others focused on Ryan. None of the people recording realized how important those videos would soon become. Ryan stepped closer and looked once again at the registration paperwork. "You said you own a construction company?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "How many employees?" "Just over 60. Ryan paused. That is a lot of responsibility. Marcus nodded politely. It is. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The sound of passing traffic filled the silence. Then Ryan asked another question. And you expect me to believe all of this belongs to you? Several witnesses immediately looked at one another. The question seemed unnecessary. The documents had already confirmed ownership. Marcus took a slow breath. The paperwork speaks for itself, officer. His response remained calm, respectful, and measured. Yet something shifted in the atmosphere after those words. The people watching began paying closer attention. They were no longer trying to determine what Marcus had done. They were trying to understand why the stop was still continuing. A young boy standing beside his mother near the gas station looked up at her. Why is he still there? He asked. The woman hesitated before answering. I do not know. The simple exchange carried more weight than anyone realized. Questions were beginning to spread beyond the shoulder of the highway. They were spreading among the witnesses themselves. As darkness approached, the flashing patrol lights became brighter against the fading sky. More vehicles passed. More people noticed. More cameras continued recording. Ryan seemed unaware that every additional minute was creating a larger and larger record of the encounter. Marcus understood something important that evening. The truth did not always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it emerged one observation at a time. One witness at a time. One recording at a time. And as the first stars appeared above Alabama, a growing collection of evidence was already being created by ordinary people who simply happened to be watching when a routine stop became a story nobody would soon forget. Several miles away in downtown Birmingham, a conference room filled with community leaders, investors, nonprofit directors, and city planners was beginning to grow restless. A large presentation screen displayed architectural renderings for a community development initiative that had taken nearly 2 years to organize. Empty coffee cups sat on tables. Folders remained unopened. Conversations grew quieter each time someone glanced toward the entrance. One seat near the front of the room remained empty. The name card placed before it read Marcus Reed. For the people gathered there, his absence made little sense. Marcus had built a reputation for reliability. He was known for arriving early, preparing thoroughly, and respecting every commitment he made. Yet the meeting had already started, and there was still no sign of him. Back on Highway 41, the traffic stop continued. Darkness was gradually settling across the Alabama sky, and the flashing patrol lights now dominated the roadside. Marcus stood beside his vehicle while Officer Ryan Mitchell remained focused on questions that seemed increasingly disconnected from the purpose of the stop. The growing audience of witnesses had not disappeared. In fact, it had expanded. Several people remained near the gas station simply because they wanted to see how the situation would end. Others continued recording. What none of them knew was that the consequences were already extending beyond the shoulder of the highway. Every minute Marcus remained there was another minute he could not spend where he was supposed to be. At the gas station, a woman named Sarah Collins stepped out of her sedan after finishing a long day at work. She initially paid little attention to the flashing lights across the road. Traffic stops were not unusual. But something about this one caught her attention. The length of the encounter. The number of witnesses. The visible tension despite the absence of any obvious reason for concern. Sarah watched quietly for several moments. Then she reached for her phone. As a civil rights attorney with more than a decade of experience, she had learned to pay attention to details. She began recording, not because she expected anything dramatic to happen, but because experience had taught her that context mattered. Unlike some of the shorter clips being captured by other witnesses, Sarah focused on documenting the entire sequence. She recorded the timing. She recorded the questions. She recorded the growing crowd and the continuing delay. Meanwhile, downtown Birmingham moved forward without Marcus. Important discussions took place. Preliminary decisions were made. Potential partners who had traveled from neighboring counties adjusted their schedules and prepared to leave. The opportunity Marcus had spent months helping organize was continuing without him. He did not know it yet, but the cost of the evening was beginning to grow. As Sarah continued recording from across the road, she noticed something else. Marcus never lost his composure. No matter how long the stop continued, he remained respectful. The contrast between his behavior and the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere around the encounter became more obvious with every passing minute. And somewhere between the missed meeting in Birmingham and the videos accumulating on dozens of phones along Highway 41, the foundation of a much larger story was quietly being built. By the time the traffic stop finally came to an end, the last traces of daylight had disappeared from the Alabama sky. Marcus Reed returned to his Escalade and sat quietly behind the wheel for several moments before pulling back onto Highway 41. The road ahead was dark, but his phone screen glowed with missed calls, unanswered messages, and notifications that continued arriving every few seconds. Most came from people connected to the community development project. Others came from friends who had already heard fragments of what happened. Marcus glanced at the screen and placed it back on the passenger seat. He was exhausted, but something told him the evening was far from over. Across town, Sarah Collins arrived home and transferred the videos from her phone to her computer. She reviewed the footage carefully. As she watched the recordings from beginning to end, certain details became impossible to ignore. The duration of the stop. The repetition of questions. The growing number of witnesses. Most importantly, the consistency of Marcus's behavior throughout the encounter. Sarah had spent years working with evidence. She understood the difference between assumptions and facts. The footage captured facts. Before ending her evening, she saved multiple backup copies and shared them with several trusted legal colleagues. Meanwhile, other recordings were already spreading online. A college student uploaded a short clip from the gas station parking lot. A delivery driver posted another angle. A commuter shared a recording taken through a windshield while passing the scene. By the following morning, thousands of people had watched portions of the encounter. Comments began appearing across local discussion groups, community forums, and social media pages. Some viewers debated what happened. Others asked a simpler question. Why had the stop lasted so long? As public attention increased, an unexpected development emerged. A regional transportation company contacted a local television reporter after recognizing the location from the videos. One of their commercial trucks had traveled through Highway 41 during the encounter. Like many modern fleet vehicles, the truck carried a forward-facing camera that recorded continuously while operating. At first, company managers believed the footage would show little of value. Then they reviewed the archive. The camera had captured nearly the entire event. Unlike the shorter clips circulating online, this recording documented a continuous timeline. There were no edits. No missing segments. No interruptions. Every minute was preserved exactly as it happened. The existence of the footage quickly attracted attention. Journalists requested copies. Attorneys reviewed the recording. Community leaders examined the timeline. For the first time, people could watch the encounter from beginning to end without relying on isolated moments or incomplete perspectives. The recording confirmed much of what witnesses had already described. More importantly, it provided context. Questions that once seemed subjective suddenly became measurable. Timing could be verified. Statements could be compared. Actions could be reviewed. Sitting alone in his office the next afternoon, Marcus watched the story expand beyond anything he had imagined. He never intended to become part of a public controversy. He had only wanted to get home after a long day. Yet the evidence now existed, and people were paying attention. The encounter that began beside a highway was no longer confined to a roadside shoulder. It had entered the public conversation. And as more people examined the growing collection of recordings, a difficult truth began to emerge. Facts have a way of surviving long after assumptions fall apart. 3 weeks later, what began as a roadside encounter had evolved into something few people could have predicted. On a cool Thursday morning, the Jefferson County Courthouse stood surrounded by reporters, community leaders, and residents who had followed the story from the beginning. Camera crews lined the sidewalk. Journalists reviewed notes. Conversations echoed quietly through the crowd as people waited for the first formal hearing to begin. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere felt serious but controlled. Marcus Reed arrived wearing a dark navy suit and carrying the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. He greeted his legal team and took his seat without seeking attention. Across the room sat Officer Ryan Mitchell. The confidence that once seemed effortless now appeared more restrained. The public scrutiny surrounding the case had changed the environment. This was no longer a conversation taking place beside a highway. It was a matter being examined under the full weight of legal review. As spectators filled the gallery, Sarah Collins entered and quietly took a seat near the back of the courtroom. Her recordings had become an important part of the evidence being reviewed. The judge entered promptly at 9 o'clock, and the hearing began. Initial proceedings focused on procedural matters. Attorneys introduced documents. Timelines were established. Witnesses were identified. At first, everything appeared routine. Then Marcus's attorneys requested permission to present video evidence. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a large screen illuminated the front of the room. The first recordings came from ordinary witnesses. Different angles. Different perspectives. Different moments from the same evening. Jurors, reporters, and spectators watched closely. Then came the footage from the commercial truck camera. Unlike the shorter clips already circulating online, this recording displayed a continuous timeline of the encounter. Minute after minute unfolded exactly as it happened. Every question. Every delay. Every exchange. There was no narration and no commentary. The footage spoke for itself. The room remained silent as the recording played. Several reporters stopped typing and simply watched. Even those who believed they understood the story appeared affected by seeing the complete sequence without interruption. When the video ended, the silence lingered. Marcus remained composed. Ryan stared forward. Neither man reacted visibly. The hearing continued with discussions about timing, procedures, and documentation. Attorneys reviewed records associated with the stop. Experts explained how the various recordings aligned with one another. Questions were asked. Answers were given. Throughout the morning, a noticeable shift began to occur. The discussion gradually moved away from opinions and toward facts that could be verified. Every document reinforced a timeline. Every timeline reinforced the evidence. During a short recess, people gathered in the courthouse hallway speaking in low voices. Many sensed that the case had reached a turning point. Back inside the courtroom, the judge announced that additional testimony and evidence review would continue during future proceedings. As everyone returned to their seats, one reality became impossible to ignore. The encounter that Ryan once believed would fade into memory had entered a place where every detail mattered. And inside that courtroom, facts carried far more authority than assumptions ever could. The next phase of the proceedings began 1 week later, and by then the case had attracted attention far beyond Birmingham. Community organizations followed every development. Local newspapers published detailed timelines. Radio hosts discussed the growing list of questions surrounding the incident. Yet inside the courthouse, the focus remained on evidence rather than headlines. Marcus Reed arrived early and took his usual seat beside his attorneys. He appeared calm, focused, and prepared for another long day. Across the room, Officer Ryan Mitchell sat quietly while legal teams organized documents and exhibits. The atmosphere felt different from the previous hearing. There was a growing sense that the investigation was expanding beyond a single evening on Highway 41. After procedural matters were completed, Marcus's legal team introduced additional records obtained during the discovery process. At first, the documents appeared routine. Administrative correspondence. Internal reviews. Complaint summaries. Personnel records. Nothing seemed dramatic when viewed individually. However, as attorneys organized the information into a timeline, a larger picture began to emerge. The courtroom screens displayed dates, reports, and documented concerns spanning several years. Spectators leaned forward. Reporters stopped whispering and began taking notes. One witness after another was called to testify. Some were business owners. Others were ordinary residents. Most had never met one another before entering the courthouse. Yet several described encounters that shared surprisingly similar characteristics. Extended questioning. Situations that continued after their original purpose had been resolved. Feelings of being singled out without clear explanation. Each account contained differences, but together they revealed patterns that were difficult to ignore. Sarah Collins listened carefully from the gallery. As an attorney, she understood the significance of recurring behavior. One incident could be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Multiple incidents required closer examination. The judge listened attentively while attorneys reviewed supporting records connected to each claim. Throughout the day, experts explained how investigators had revisited previous complaints after the Highway 41 videos became public. Cases that once received little attention were examined again. Additional interviews were conducted. Documentation was reviewed. Timelines were verified. The process remained methodical and professional. No dramatic accusations filled the room. Instead, facts accumulated one piece at a time. Marcus watched quietly as the evidence developed. He never appeared interested in revenge. What mattered to him was understanding the truth. Meanwhile, Ryan's legal team attempted to challenge portions of the testimony and emphasize differences between the various incidents. Some distinctions certainly existed. Yet the similarities remained impossible to overlook. By late afternoon, the courtroom atmosphere had changed noticeably. The discussion was no longer centered solely on what happened to Marcus. The conversation had expanded into a broader examination of conduct, accountability, and responsibility. Reporters exchanged glances as new documents appeared on the courtroom screens. Community members sitting in the gallery whispered quietly among themselves. Everyone seemed to recognize that the case had reached another turning point. What began as a traffic stop involving one driver and one officer was evolving into something much larger. As the judge concluded the day's proceedings and scheduled the final stage of review, a powerful realization settled across the room. Evidence does not become stronger because people believe it. Evidence becomes stronger because facts continue leading to the same conclusion. And with every document reviewed, every witness heard, and every timeline confirmed, the distance between assumption and truth was becoming smaller than ever before. The final hearing arrived beneath gray morning skies that seemed to mirror the seriousness of the moment. Long before the courthouse doors opened, reporters gathered outside with cameras and notebooks while residents from across Birmingham quietly formed lines along the sidewalk. Inside, every available seat was occupied. The case that began on the shoulder of Highway 41 had become one of the most closely followed local stories of the year. Yet despite the attention surrounding the proceedings, the atmosphere inside the courtroom remained disciplined and respectful. Marcus Reed entered with the same calm presence that had defined him from the beginning. He greeted his attorneys, took his seat, and waited. Across the room, Officer Ryan Mitchell appeared noticeably different from the man who had stood beside the flashing patrol lights several weeks earlier. The confidence that once seemed automatic had been replaced by a more cautious expression. Months of scrutiny, testimony, and evidence review had changed the landscape. This was no longer about appearances. It was about documented facts. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The final stage of the proceedings began with a review of the evidence presented throughout the hearings. The recordings from witnesses. The commercial truck footage. The testimony. The administrative records. The timelines. Each piece had been examined carefully. Each had contributed to a larger picture. As the judge summarized the findings, spectators listened intently. Reporters typed rapidly. Attorneys remained focused on every word. The court concluded that the traffic stop had continued far beyond what the documented circumstances reasonably required. The ruling referenced the consistency of the video evidence and the importance of objective documentation in evaluating conduct. The court also acknowledged the professional opportunities Marcus had missed as a direct result of the extended encounter, including the significant community development meeting he had been unable to attend. The findings did not rely on emotion. They relied on evidence. That fact gave them weight. As the decision continued, additional measures were announced. Administrative reviews already underway would proceed. Internal procedures would be re-evaluated. Oversight recommendations would be implemented. Reporting standards would receive additional scrutiny. The consequences extended beyond a single evening because the investigation had revealed concerns that demanded attention. Throughout the ruling, Marcus remained composed. He did not celebrate. He did not react dramatically. He simply listened. For him, the outcome represented something larger than personal vindication. It represented recognition that facts still mattered. Across the room, Ryan sat quietly as the findings were read into the official record. The courtroom remained remarkably calm. There were no raised voices. No dramatic interruptions. Only the steady voice of the judge outlining conclusions supported by months of careful review. When the ruling finally ended, a brief silence settled across the room. It was the kind of silence that follows an important truth. Reporters exchanged glances. Community leaders nodded thoughtfully. Many people understood that they had witnessed more than the resolution of a legal dispute. They had witnessed accountability arriving through process rather than passion. As the judge prepared to adjourn the hearing, one reality became clear to everyone present. A moment that once seemed destined to disappear into memory had instead forced an entire system to examine itself more closely. And in the end, it was not assumptions, authority, or public opinion that shaped the outcome. It was evidence, patience, and the persistent power of the truth. The courthouse slowly emptied as the afternoon gave way to evening. Reporters packed away cameras and notebooks. Attorneys gathered documents that had filled conference tables for months. Community members lingered in small groups along the hallways, discussing what they had witnessed. The legal battle was over, but the conversations it had started would continue long after the courtroom doors closed. Marcus Reed stepped outside and paused near the top of the courthouse steps. The Birmingham skyline glowed beneath a warm sunset, and for the first time in weeks, the noise surrounding the case seemed distant. He stood quietly, looking across the city he had spent years helping build. The journey that brought him there had never been part of any plan. One ordinary drive home had unexpectedly become a test of patience, character, and perseverance. Yet standing there now, Marcus understood that the most important victory had nothing to do with legal documents or public attention. It was the simple fact that he never allowed someone else's assumptions to define who he was. A few moments later, Sarah Collins emerged from the courthouse carrying a folder beneath one arm. She joined Marcus near the steps and looked out toward the city. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. The process they had trusted had finally reached its conclusion. "You handled all of it with more patience than most people could," Sarah said. Marcus smiled slightly. Getting angry would not have changed. The facts. Sarah nodded. She knew that was true. Throughout the entire ordeal, Marcus had remained consistent. He never sought revenge. He never tried to become a public figure. He simply refused to abandon his dignity. In the months that followed, life gradually moved forward. The community development project Marcus had missed eventually secured new partnerships and funding. Construction crews began work. Training programs opened their doors. Families gained opportunities that once existed only as proposals on paper. The project became a reminder that setbacks do not always stop progress. Sometimes they simply delay it. Meanwhile, conversations about accountability continued throughout the region. Policies were reviewed. Procedures received closer examination. Community meetings attracted larger audiences than before. Many people realized that meaningful change rarely begins with dramatic speeches. More often, it begins when ordinary facts receive extraordinary attention. One evening several months later, Marcus found himself driving along Highway 41 again. The same stretch of road looked remarkably ordinary. Cars passed. Traffic flowed. The shoulder where everything began appeared no different from any other section of highway. Yet for Marcus, it represented something important. Not resentment. Not anger. Perspective. Because he understood something that many people forget. Character is easiest to claim during comfortable moments. Its true value appears when circumstances become difficult. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Marcus continued driving toward home. The headlines would eventually fade. The videos would stop circulating. New stories would replace old ones. But the lesson would remain. Authority may influence a moment, but accountability shapes a legacy. And in the end, the truth did not prevail because it was louder than anything else. It prevailed because it never changed. The man who stood beside that highway kept his dignity. The system was forced to confront the facts. And long after the cameras were gone, one simple truth remained. Respect is given freely by character, but when it is denied, the cost of recovering it can become greater than anyone ever expected.